Hi, everybody. Just grab the nearest chair and come on in. We'll be with you in a few moments while everyone gets in. While we wait, my name is Sharon McFarland. I'm the Communications Officer here in the Faculty of Science Advancement. And I kind of like to know where everyone's coming from. We have people registered from all over the world, from the United States, abroad, Hong Kong, Canada, of course. So you'll see a chat feature at the very bottom of your screen. So please let us know where you are tonight, where you're coming from. And keep in mind that we have West Vancouver, Dave Guthrow. How you doing? Nice to see you again, virtually, of course. Winnipeg, wow, all over the place. Waterloo, good to see you. Uh, BC, bet you're having nicer weather than we are at the moment. And it's a good time to actually reach out to some of your fellow alumni. What classes do we have here? Graduating class of, if you remember it, by all means, speak out. Class of 77, nice. 2020, excellent, most recent alum. 84, Chris, good to see you. Good to have a nice round amount of people here too. Class of 77, Leslie, hi. 85. Physics 85, great stuff. Class of 88, it's a good class. Okay, a few more minutes here, I think, and we'll get started. We've got a great feature speaker tonight. I'm really excited to have you here, Karen, speak. Physics 77, lots of physics people here tonight. This is good. Okay, well, my name is Sharon McFarland. Again, I'm the Science Advancement Communications Officer. I'm thrilled to welcome here tonight. We're so excited to bring you this new faculty speaker series. Tonight we feature Karen Cummings. She's the brave one to step up first, which is so amazing. So I've done a lot of alumni events in my time here at Waterloo. Usually I'm at restaurant, hotel, convention, museum. This is my first Zoom one. So normally I tell people where the bathrooms are, where to get a drink, where the exits are. But this time I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out in your own place. But what I can do actually is tell you a few tips on how to best view tonight's speaker series. The first would be the type of view that you're in. For those of us using Zoom for the first time, up top you'll see a feature says speaker view or gallery view. To make the most of this, I think you might want to press speaker view, and that will allow you to see Karen's lecture in full versus just a bunch of random people around you. Everyone tonight, with the exception of the panelists, will be muted and will not have their audio on. So don't worry about if your kids come in behind you with dinner or a problem, or your husband or wife walks by, you won't be seen tonight. Also tonight, we have the opportunity to ask some questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. Tonight, Dr. Brian McNamara will actually be taking those questions from there, as opposed to the chat box. The chat box we're just going to use for some comments, for telling me that you're from the chemistry class of 82, and just some kind of friendly banter back and forth. But the actual questions will be from the Q&A box. So with that, I'm going to pass you over to tonight's host. He's the chair of our Physics and Astronomy department. So I bring you Dr. Brian McNamara.
Thanks very much, Sharon. It's really a thrill for me and an honor to lead the Department of Physics and Astronomy and to introduce our new speaker series. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge our native peoples before we move on to the talk. So the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building. And this work is centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. So with that, I'm thrilled again to introduce the first speaker in our new faculty series highlighting new faculty to Waterloo. It's a new initiative, not just to highlight emerging faculty and research areas, but it's an initiative to engage you, our students and alumni, and bring you back to campus, at least virtually. And so it's really exciting. You're going to see in this series some amazing research that's happening on campus, some cutting edge research that has led to the increasing reputation of the University of Waterloo. I also want to point out that our next event is scheduled for January 28th, and at the end of Karen's talk, she'll highlight that speaker. And so I do invite you to keep an eye on that and come back following the talk tonight. Before I introduce Karen, I just wanted to give you some good news. The QS World Rankings on universities came out, and Waterloo as a whole has done remarkably well. We're moving up in the overall rankings. And as this is a physics talk tonight, I'm really excited to let you know that the University of Waterloo physics has now moved up into the top 50 to 75 departments across the entire globe. It wasn't just a few years back when we were in the top 200, we moved into the top 150. Last year we moved into the top 100, and now we're in the top 50 to 75. And as you can see, our vector is going up. And it's really exciting, but it's due to a lot of hard work within the department, but more importantly, it's due to you who've sent us so much talent in your sons and daughters. It's due to those of you, the taxpayer, who helps support our research on campus. It's due to the many administrators, presidents, and deans and former chairs that worked hard to get us there. But again, primarily it's due to you, and I want to thank you for that. I think it's really exciting, and it is allowing us to both attract the top talent in Canada and across the globe, and that includes you who are watching, but it also allows us to attract top faculty and staff talent, and that's how I want to segue into Karen Cummings, who just joined us in the last couple of years. And surely if it wasn't for the reputation that you've helped us build, we would not have been able to attract a world-class researcher such as Karen Cummings, who's known throughout the globe for her work on physics education research. So Karen Cummings joined us, Dr. Karen Cummings joined us in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in September 2019. Prior to coming to Waterloo, she spent 18 years in the Department of Physics at Southern Connecticut State in New Haven, where she was professor of physics, director of assessment for the university-wide requirements program, and co-director for the Center for Excellence in Mathematics and Science. Karen's career as a physics education researcher began more than 20 years ago when she worked on the very first flipped classrooms. So she's a pioneer of what has now become a standard form of education across the world and is growing here. She's leading this charge here at Waterloo to ensure that education in physics and across science is as good as it can be. She has given hundreds of talks on topics related to physics education. And in fact, this is how we got to know Karen. She gave talks to our department on at least 2 occasions, dealing with advanced methods for educating our students. And it was through that we got to know her, and we had an eye on trying to hire her. And when the opportunity arose a couple of years ago, we were able to draw her to Waterloo. She's written many papers, including 2 works commissioned by the US National Academy of Sciences. Karen spent several years of her life writing an introductory physics textbook with co-authors Priscilla Laws and Joe Radish, and that incorporated her research findings. She was trained as an experimental condensed matter physicist, completing her PhD in the Ion Accelerator Laboratory at the University of Albany in upstate New York. And she has now joined us as a member of our faculty. And tonight, Karen is going to tell you about her really exciting research into physics education. And it's a thrill for me to introduce her because she's already having a huge impact on our department in bringing our teaching standards up to a level that's even higher than we were before. And we have some pretty outstanding teachers in our department. So with that, Karen, take it away. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I hope to give everyone a talk that's accessible and interesting. It's an introductory level talk in regard to physics education research. And so for those of you who have expertise in this field, I apologize in advance for the level. But I think for most people, it'll be interesting and accessible. And I hope that in the end, you'll have some questions that you'll feel free to ask about. So Brian did a great job of introducing me. The only thing that I'd like to share is that part of the reason that I came to Waterloo is because my husband is in the physics department as well. And so it's really a great opportunity to be able to work with him because we both worked on this course that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So that's really the reason I want to share that with you, is that it's relevant. In addition to that, I was thrilled to be able to come to a department where I would be working closely with a female Nobel laureate. So it's really a wonderful place, Waterloo, and I feel very fortunate to be there. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the field of physics education research and focus primarily on how we make measurements within the field, what that's all about, because that's really what I'm interested in. I'm a data person, I'm a measurement person. That's really what I enjoy. And I'm going to, in doing that, try to make it more interesting and more relevant by sort of highlighting some key findings that came out of those types of measurement techniques. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit about how we make measurements and then also some of these key findings. And then lastly, I'll give you a discussion of our online version of the Physics 1 course that we teach for our physics majors. We have a couple of different Physics 1 courses. I'm going to focus on the one we teach for our physics majors, including our thoroughly remote approach to lab. And both the lecture and the lab have ended up being just completely grounded in physics education research because COVID was so disruptive that everything sort of had to be redone, and we were just at the right place in the right time, and we've been able to really do some interesting things. So I look forward to talking about that. So what is physics education research? Well, physics education research is what's called discipline-specific educational research. So it is educational research, but it's not sort of general kind of educational research. It's often very specific to physics. So a lot of the research is as specific as what are student difficulties in learning about tunneling in quantum mechanics or something like that. So they don't necessarily map really well to biology or something like that. But in the United States, all of these fields, these different STEM fields, have their own discipline-based educational research. There's physics education research, which is the first educational research and definitely the best educational research community. But there are others. So, there's engineering education research, there's chemistry education research, biology. All of these fields have these research communities now. And so if you are here because you are interested, but you're not a physicist, I encourage you to Google your favorite discipline and then educational research and see what you get. You'll probably get some interesting things. So I'll try to highlight the more general findings in this talk today, so that hopefully no matter what discipline you come from, you'll learn something. One of the great things about physics education research is it's a very interdisciplinary type of research. Really, it involves physics and a really deep understanding of physics, and the learning sciences, which include things these days like cognitive psychology, and even neuroscience. And so it becomes a more and more scientific approach to understanding how people learn. Um, Physics education research, which I often will abbreviate as PER, employs scientific approaches and ways of thinking. And anybody who was trained in an education department might now be saying, well, what do you mean? All education employs scientific approaches and ways of thinking. And that's true, but physics education research originally, if you to think about how it was originally envisioned is helpful. And that was that it would be educational research done by physics PhDs. Um, for example, like me, my PhD is in experimental condensed matter physics, and these people had faculty positions within physics departments. So that's what sort of separates physics education research from maybe science education research that would be done out of a school of education. So it is the people who are teaching the university physics courses, who are doing the research, and the idea behind that was that those are the people who are best positioned to improve the courses. They have the power to be able to improve the courses. And in addition to that, these faculty members who are teaching these university courses have what we call in teacher training circles pedagogical content knowledge. That is, they not only understand the content deeply, they understand how to teach it to students in ways that work. And so that's sort of in a nutshell what physics education research is. And to me, a really, really big part of the field is this cycle that's shown here on this slide. So the idea is that physics education researchers don't make curricular changes just because they want to or because it seems like it's a good idea. What happens is people start with a body of knowledge, a published, peer-reviewed body of knowledge about what works, in this case, in regard to teaching in physics. And then based on that, maybe make some curricular modification, maybe design a new course or a new activity or do some kind of a reform of a course. And then make direct measures. They assess how well this change that they've made has made some change in terms of learning outcomes or other course goals. Sometimes it's like attitudes or whatever. But the idea is you start with some body of knowledge about how people learn physics. You use that to make a good guess about a curricular innovation. And then you measure how well that worked. And in measuring how well that works, you actually add to the body of scholarly knowledge about what works in physics education. So it's this great cycle, and it can be applied both as a research cycle, but also as a curriculum improvement cycle on an ongoing basis. And when that happens, it's often called action research, and it can result in some really well-functioning courses. So I'm going to talk to you about that cycle quite a bit. And it revolves around this idea of making measurements. And this really is my interest. Trained as an experimental condensed matter physicist, I spent a lot of time looking at data. I loved data. And when I got interested in this field, that's what I wanted to. I wanted data, and there were people who were collecting quantitative measurements of learning. And I thought, wow, that's cool. And that's what I wanted to do. So people in physics education research study several different kinds of topics. This is not an exhaustive list in any way, but it's very common to study particular conceptual understanding at various levels. Sometimes people study problem solving, gender and minority group identity formation, and other issues, attitudes and beliefs about learning science. This is often especially relevant with people who are going to be teachers. Effective use of technology in the classrooms, what works, what doesn't matter. And institutional change is another really interesting topic. We have real information about things that make a difference. How come more people don't use that information and make changes in these courses? And then within these topics, people use different approaches to study them. So the ones that are nearest and dearest to my heart are quantitative and direct measures of learning outcomes. Those, there are also quantitative but indirect measures of learning outcomes, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference between those. So to talk to you a little bit about these measures of direct learning and indirect and direct measures of learning, I wanted to draw your attention to this article. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. And it was published by someone who's friendly with the physics department here, Louis Delore. He's at Harvard. And he's given a talk a couple of times in the teaching seminar that I gave talks in that led me to want to be here at Waterloo. And this paper that he put out compares direct measures of learning, so what he calls actual learning. He has a direct measure of learning, sort of like a test of what you would want them to be able to do on the final exam. And he compares that to indirect measures of learning, like feelings about learning. So again, actual learning, that's the direct measure of learning. Feelings about learning, those are indirect measures of learning. So course evaluations, indirect measures of learning. Surveys about what students like, indirect measures of learning. But I'll show you some direct measures of learning that we've collected data on as well. So what Louis found was that there's an interesting connection between direct measures of learning and indirect measures of learning, especially students' self-reported levels of learning. So in general, the message is that liking a course doesn't necessarily mean that you learn a lot in that course. And you can sort of see this on the left is the direct measure of learning. The lighter bars are the passive lecture-based course. And, And the darker bars are the active learning enhanced courses. And on the direct measure of learning, the active engagement course scored better. The students appear to have learned more, and this is typical. That's a typical result in physics education research, is that as you improve the level of student interaction, you improve learning outcomes, keeping everything else the same. What's really interesting about this paper is that for the same students, Louis measured their indirect, he included these indirect measures of learning, how they felt about things. I enjoyed the lecture. I feel like I learned a lot from the lecture. The instructor was effective at teaching. I wish all my physics courses were taught this way. For across all of those questions, including the I feel like I learned a lot, the passive environment scored higher. So there really is a disconnect between a student's perception of learning, what they like, and learning itself. And it's important that we keep that in mind when we're discussing what works and what doesn't work in classrooms. I think it's really important for students to like their courses and like their teachers. I believe that's really important, but it's not a direct measure of learning, and there are complications in connecting the two. So that's a key finding in physics education. Those are quantitative, direct, and indirect measures. That we also do a lot of qualitative work in physics education research. I don't really do any of this work, although I have a little tiny bit, but mostly not. Qualitative measures include things like interviews and case studies. You can really learn a lot from them. It's just not my area of expertise. And then there are people who do actually sort of, they struggle to do theoretical considerations in what is frankly a very messy situation. Learning in general is complicated, and learning within the context of an introductory physics course, say, is a hard thing to model theoretically, but there are people who try. And the other really interesting avenues, including things like functional MRI studies while people are doing particular physics tasks. So all kinds of interesting stuff that people work on within this field. So one of the things that happens with direct measures, a common methodology for using direct measures of student learning, is to do what's called pre-instruction, post-instruction testing. And the reason that this is important is because, if you have a bunch of students and at the end of the term you give them a test and they all did really well on this test, maybe they knew all of that stuff at the beginning of the term. You don't know that. Or if they scored 50%, you don't know whether that's like yeah, I did a good job number or not. And so one of the ideas that helps a lot in doing physics education research is you give the same test twice. So you measure student understanding or attitudes or whatever at the very beginning of the term before instruction and at the end of term after instruction. You use the same test and you make direct comparisons for the students. Um, these should not count for grades because otherwise students start archiving answers and then the research tool loses its viability. So we protect these assessments quite well. I think we've been fairly successful at that. The assessments are not ever released. We don't give students the answers to these assessments, but we do release grades sometimes. So for example, we released grades in the physics course this term, and we did that so that students had some direct information about their level of preparedness. With COVID messing up the end of their senior year, they also are feeling sort of insecure about their levels of preparation. And so these assessment grades help them to understand both in terms of their conceptual understanding and their ability to solve problems, sort of where they were at. And so sometimes it is good to release the grades, but we don't release the assessments. This is a good example of the use of pre-post assessment. This is one of the most famous papers in physics education research. It was published in the American Journal of Physics. It's called Interactive Engagement versus Traditional Methods for a 6,000 student survey. This was done in 1998. And it was done with this exam called the Force Concept Inventory, or the FCI. And now there's probably 100 times as much data on this test. And much of it is used to show sort of routinely in many different environments that there's a difference between a passive, traditionally structured course where lecture really is the mode of instruction and other more interactive courses. But it uses a pre-post methodology. So on the horizontal axis, that's the percent correct pretest score on this test, the Force Concept Inventory. I'll talk to you about a similar test here in just a moment. But that's the percent correct at the beginning of term. And then on the vertical axis is the percent gain. So if you have a student who came in at 20% and went out at 40%, then their point would be on that line. So if you look at these if you look at these data points, it's a little bit hard to see, but there are two colors of data points. One of the sets of data points is colored in, and those are circled here at the lower the lower end of the graph. Those are the traditionally structured courses, and you can see there's noise. There are some of the darkly colored symbols that bounce into higher regions, or higher vertical regions in the graph. But for the most part, the points that are colored are low. The points that are not colored are higher on the vertical axis. And that is a general result that we see over and over again, that at different pretest scores, whether you come in low end or high end, typically interactive engagement techniques work better. So these lines are lines of common levels of improvement. We call them normalized gain lines. So the red one is 100%. So it's like if you come in at 100%, you go up by 0%. So you're at this point way over here in the lower right. You come in at 100%, you can't improve. So the percent gain, if you go out at 100%, then you're in this lower point, you're in this lower right-hand corner here with a 0% gain and 100% pretest score. Likewise, if you come in at 50, and I apologize, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm probably a little bit off here on this 50, but if you come in at 50 and you go out at 50, I'm sorry, if you come in at 50 and you get a 50% improvement, you go out at 100, you also have a 100% gain. So this is a 100% gain line, and it transcends where you come in. If you come in at 10, then you go up by 90%, then you also come out at 100%, and you've gained everything that you could possibly gain. The blue and green lines are similar lines of normalized gain, which allow us to compare scores across a range of pretest scores. There's data here from Harvard, there's data here from small colleges with challenged students. And the green line is low levels of overall gain. The blue is considered sort of a medium level, and the red is, 100%, which nobody could do. But you see a general trend, and this is both a classic use of pre-post instruction testing and a super important, commonly referred to finding in physics education research and most science education research fields, that active engagement adds to the story. And so there are many people who are trying to do that, and it's not so easy to do, but people are trying. So the measurements that we made at Waterloo recently involved two of my favorite tests. One of them I wrote and one of them I didn't. The one that I didn't is the force and motion conceptual evaluation. It measures student understanding of concepts, just like the force concept inventory does, which was the first widely used assessment tool in physics education research. They're both conceptual multiple choice exams. This force motion conceptual evaluation and the force concept inventory, both multiple choice conceptual exams. Physics is blessed with a fair level of agreement about what's important to teach in the first term. So that allows us to develop some assessment tools that have some broad acceptance in the physics education and physics and university physics departments. There's 47 questions. They cover force, motion, and energy. There are several questions on the same topic, like maybe Newton's third law is asked about from several different directions. So you get some additional confidence that you understand how well a particular student or your population in general understands that topic. And that's really useful for improving instruction and also for doing research. It's given in a pre-post methodology. And so you can look at improvements. The questions look sort of like this. There's a whole bunch of what we call distractors, that is, wrong answers. They basically represent any conceptual model the students could have. So there's always an attractive distractor for the students. And then there will be a sequence of questions related to those distractors. So this question is, which force would keep the sled moving towards the right and speeding up at a steady rate, that is constant acceleration? So here we're asking, do they understand that constant acceleration means constant force? So we need a constant force to produce that constant acceleration. And do they realize that the direction of the force needs to be the same as the direction of the acceleration? There's a preamble to this question that says this person is pushing on a sled that's on ice, and the person has spiked shoes. So there's no friction involved here. So this probes student understanding of basically Newton's second law. When we look at the distribution of scores on this test, 47 questions on this test, we gave it to the Physics 1 students this term. We gave it to them last term as well. It's a remarkable distribution Waterloo gets. Really, I've never seen anything like it, and I've looked at a lot of data on this test. There's a huge high-end bump. So Waterloo is, as Brian pointed out, blessed with a growing reputation, and they are able to recruit amazing students. Some of them are really amazing students with perimeter close by. Theory is great. There's a great collection of people doing theory in the department, and the experimental side of the physics department is amazing as well, with a Nobel Prize winner and all kinds of world-class labs. Quantum Computing Center, really a lot to bring students to Waterloo. So there's this huge bump of great students at the top, students who deserve a great course. But then there's also this other really long distribution of students, and this distribution is a little bit more drawn out than last year's was. So you kind of could see maybe some COVID effects in here, but for the most part, in terms of conceptual understanding, Waterloo's Physics 1 course for the majors, and also and there are computer science majors and math majors and aviation majors. The biology students take a separate course. That population that's in here, these sort of hard science types, uh, there's a big range of conceptual understanding. So that's a real thing that needs to be sort of acknowledged and planned for in these courses. That was interesting. The second assessment that we gave this year, we did not give it last year, but we gave it this year, is an assessment that I wrote, which is a measure of students' ability to solve just standard regular physics textbook problems, or close to regular physics textbook problems. So the problems are single concept problems. They cover the context of Newton's second law, conservation of energy, and conservation of momentum. These are three of the foundational topics we cover in Physics 1. The problem design, the assessment design is the following. Problems get increasingly difficult. So there are 4 Newton's second law problems. The first one is as easy as you can make it and still have it be a problem. And then the next one's a little harder, and the next one's a little harder, and then the last one is hard. And then the same kind of thing for conservation of energy and conservation of momentum. So there's an increasing level of difficulty on these problems. The test is time. And so if it takes you a long time on the early problems, you don't have time to work on the later problems. And the problems are graded right, wrong. And with that design, the gradated difficulty level, the timing, and the grading right and wrong, we get very reliable results that correlate well with other measures of problem-solving ability, like written final exams and so on. And if we grade for partial credit, we get equivalent scores to just grading right and wrong. So it's a well-functioning study. The tool works. It's given pre-post. Students are given the formulas. So there's a formula sheet at the beginning that they can rip off that says, like, for example, kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared, and that net force is equal to mass times acceleration. It gives trigonometric relationships because they will need those. And no calculators are needed because we've chosen numbers so that the students can just do math with the trigonometric relationships and get an answer pretty easily if they want to. If they use calculators, they can, but it really just slows them down. So this is a couple of examples of the force questions. In the first one, it's a simple, one person pushes one way, the other person pushes the other way. With these certain magnitude forces, what's the acceleration? That's about as easy of a Newton's second law problem as you can write and have it be something other than just plugging numbers into a formula, which, by the way, some students get wrong too. So, and then the next problem over is, I think, the third difficulty level. You have to break forces into components. You have to use a little trigonometry. And so on. So it's a more difficult, but still fairly straightforward problem. And so the test is like that. And the distribution for Waterloo students is like I wrote the test for them. They're a perfect sort of normal distribution around the average, which is 50. And again, it's not like that happens all the time. So, so that's an interesting combination of characteristics for the students, and it tells us things. And that's one of the really big advantages of doing this pre-post testing, is that you get actual information about who your students are, and you can use that in planning your course. And so that's really what we did. We had some information from last year about how broad the distribution was. So we knew we had that issue going in, and we knew we had that high-end clump of really, really good students that we wanted to take care of. And so we took that into account. And because this COVID situation was so disruptive, we got to really sort of completely re-envision both the lecture part of the introductory physics course for majors, which is Physics 121, but also the lab that was associated with it. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So Physics 121 is the calculus-based Physics 1 course. It does have a lab. Not everybody who takes the lecture part of the course has to take the lab part of the course. It's the first course for our physics majors, whether they're in astronomy track or physics track. All of the physics and astronomy majors, this is their first course. So we really care a lot about how it goes and what their experience is. It was clear to my husband, Richard Epp, and I, who are co-teaching this course, that if we did a terrible job with this course and we trashed our freshman class, we'd be paying for that as that class moved through. And so we take the course very seriously, and we put effort into it that we wouldn't necessarily put into every course. It's taken first term in the first year, as I said, by a collection of different majors, all of which are important to the School of Science. So it's a good, it was a good course to be able to do a nice job on. So related to it, sort of coincidentally, before COVID hit, the dean of the School of Science had started this great initiative, which he called the Dean's Undergraduate Teaching Initiative. He had quite a large pool of money, and he entertained proposals for funding of innovative undergraduate teaching. And before I came to the department, people put together proposals, and a couple of those projects, at least a couple of those projects were funded. And we call these duty projects, and there are two of them impacted the development of this course. And so I really wanted to say thank you to the dean's office for this initiative, because I think that it positioned us to be in the right place at the right time. And so the first project that is relevant, the first duty project that's relevant, is one that was aimed at improving the first first year science courses. So our first physics courses, Physics 121 for the majors, and then another first physics course for the algebra-based Physics 1 course, which we call Physics 111. That's mostly for biology sort of oriented people. This project was aimed at improving both of those courses by trying to become more student-centered, sort of looking seriously at who the students were. And within the course for physics majors, this was before I came here, the idea was in Physics 121 to develop what was called rocket science activities. And these really were aimed at these better prepared students. And the idea was, first of all, those are a significant number of students. We should address their needs. We had programs for the underprepared students. We have a program called Physics Learning Accelerator, PLA, that does a great job with students who need some help at the lower end. We really didn't have anything special going on for those students at the high end, and people wanted that. The other thing that motivated these activities was a desire to separate this physics course from the high school physics course they took. How is this course different? One way it's different is they are engaging in activities where they take this physics that you learn in an introductory course and they apply it to these really cool, basically real world problems involved in rocket science, which physics and astronomy students love. So we tested these. Richard Epp wrote them. We tested these. I thought they would be terrible because they were just too hard. But we tested them last year, and especially the keeners loved them. It's true, the students at the low end couldn't deal with it. They were totally overwhelmed. But the students at the high end, which is more than a third of the course, they loved them. They would say things like, this is the only reason I don't care, I don't mind going to tutorial, I live for these. They really loved them. So when it came time to think about this year's course in COVID, we remembered those rocket science activities, and we'll talk some more about it. The other really great synergy that occurred with a duty project was that a second duty project that was awarded to the Department of Physics and Astronomy was associated with the labs that are part of this course some students take. The idea was to refocus the introductory lab on development of experimental skills. And so they've done a great job of doing that. I'm going to talk some more about that. But that's the second duty project. It includes it really a shift in focus to an evidence-based model development and testing kind of an environment where you're developing models and asking does this work, and experimental design. The students design their own labs. So I'm going to come back to lab at the very end. Um, so, so what did we do? So what did we end up doing? So we started by taking a really hard look at what our course goals were, um, and what the constraints were of the online environment, what we could do and what we could not do. There are real issues associated with the online environment, a whole collection of them that has to be dealt with, and so you can't do just anything. We were concerned about giving high value tests in this environment for lots of reasons, including the stress it puts on the students. And so we sort of went a different direction. We thought about what resources were available within the department and the school and the university. And fortunately, in the physics department, we had enough resources to do what really, frankly, was quite an ambitious Physics 1 course with these students. And we've, like I said, fortunately found these really productive connections to these duty projects that had been underway previous to COVID and could move forward really happily, like really a win-win situation for everyone. And so we thought about our course goals. And when we really thought about like what could we do and what would we miss the most from Physics 121 when it's taught in person, what we really came down to was that in this first physics course, in their first term of their first year, one of the huge things that happens is the students meet one another. They develop friendships. They begin to feel a part of Waterloo physics and the community at Waterloo in general, and that was really important going forward and important right now. And we wanted to somehow keep that. Um, the other thing that's a really high priority course goal for this introductory physics course, it's hard to exactly say it, but it's the obvious goal. When students finish this course, we need them to understand that material that we covered at the level we covered it. And that might seem like, in some ways, sort of a trivial thing to say, but the problem is remember this distribution. So we have some students who already know that stuff. They knew it when they were 12. And they don't really get much out of doing it again. But then there's all these other students at all different levels, at all different places, who have holes or maybe really lacked a background in general. And we need to deal with them as well. And so that was also the guiding goal. And then the third really important goal for this course is we want students to come out of this course seeing physics as cool and beautiful, because that's one of the things that Physics 121 did before COVID. And it's one of the things that I think it's really important for Physics 121 to continue to do, even as we incorporate physics education research into the course. We still want students to have an introductory course that leaves them thinking, wow, this is amazing. And I'm really glad that I came to Waterloo to study physics. And part of the reason that Physics 121 has been so successful at that is my husband here. This is Richard Epp. He's a great lecturer. Waterloo is blessed with a collection of just incredible lecturers. And that's a really valuable resource. Like, I mean, if you look on YouTube, there are physics lecturers, and I'm sure in other disciplines as well, who have cult followings. And it's great for the reputations of their schools, and it's great for helping students learn physics and be enthusiastic about learning physics. And so Richard got, the department found money to provide people who wanted them what's called a light board. So Richard got one of these. He's got an artistic talent and nice, neat handwriting. I have terrible handwriting, super ugly. So he makes beautiful artwork on this light board, and his lectures are always known to be incredibly clear and motivational and inspirational for the students. He does general relativity, so there's almost no answer. I mean, no question you can ask him anything, and he usually can come up with a reasonable answer before too long. In fact, sometimes I think we should have a stump the professor night, but anyway. So, but I just want to remind people, though, that lectures have issues. And this article is about the dangers of fluent lectures, and this is also a well-established result. Um, in some ways, the better the lecturer, the less learning occurs because students sit there and say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. But what they really need to do is to struggle with the material and to trigger neurons in their heads enough that they make connections between ideas, appropriate connections between ideas. Um, that's my timer that tells me I'm up. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. So we didn't just design the course around lectures. We really made remote collaborative group work at the core of what this course was about. We figured in this way, students would be able to make connections with one another. They would be working in collaborative groups of 4, but remotely. They can make friends. And then we reorganize the groups quite often. So by the end of the term, they will have worked with 5 different groups of 4, and they will have met other physics majors. Great for making connections, good for everyone's mental health. We know that collaborative group work is very effective. And it gave us a way that students had someone to ask when they had a question. Because one of the big problems with this online environment is when a student has a question, if the only person they can write to really to get an answer is the professors can't deal with that. So we have students work in collaborative groups twice a week. We have 2-week modules. So there's a sequence of 4 group meetings in a module, 2 each week. And they start with a conceptual tutorial, which is accessible to everyone. So even the students at the very low end, these are physics education research-based tutorials that came out of the University of Washington group. It's called Tutorials in Introductory Physics. They produce good conceptual learning at many different diverse institutions. I'm hopeful they're going to be good here. We haven't made the post-test measures yet, so we don't really know. But my guess is that they probably will be successful. So students start there in their group. Everyone in the group does it. This is probably easy for the high-end students, but still they're really well done tutorials. So probably most people learn something there. Then the next meeting they have is a basic problem solving meeting, and they have a template which sort of forces them to write out a good solution to a fairly basic problem, to include things like diagrams, to acknowledge what the core physics principles are, and so on. And then the next thing they do is they do more advanced problems, long answer problems that are more like they would have done in the past on an exam or for maybe a weekly assignment within a tutorial. And then last but not least, the culminating experience for these group activities are these rocket science activities that are really for the very high, to make sure that those very high-end students also have something that they find challenging and interesting. We feed into that cycle through reading and lectures, Richard's beautiful lectures, and we have a good textbook. And then we get additional feedback on the students' learning in 2 ways. They do an online homework set, just like they would have done when we met in person. And they do this really cool thing that we came up with because we didn't want them cheating, which is that they have to write their own question and a solution. So that's their group project. At the end of each module, their group has to come up with a good question, and we have rubrics which identify like what constitutes a good question. And then they have to write a good solution for that question, and then that stuff is graded by a TA. So we had lots of constraints to deal with. One was whether students would work in synchronous or asynchronous groups. What percentage you think wanted to work in synchronous groups, and what percentage you think wanted to work in asynchronous groups? Because we asked them and put them in whatever kind of groups they wanted. What percentage? was 90% wanted synchronous groups. 90% wanted synchronous groups the first time we asked them, and 90% have wanted synchronous groups the whole time. But we do offer an asynchronous option. It's not that difficult. Time zones are an issue. I put these students into groups and I rotate them on a regular basis. It's not random. And the real kicker for me that can't get me past that is the time zone issues. It's really not fair to people who are in another time zone to put them with the majority of people who are in Waterloo, because that's what happened. Is that for most of the students are in Waterloo time zone. These are the responses for time zones. Most of the students, 76%, are in Waterloo time zone. There's a few out on the West Coast. There are a few that are sort of in Europe. And then there's a contingent in Beijing. And if you're not careful, you mix these people together, nobody can get together, and it causes a lot of problems. So there were not many time zone issues. It's not a huge number of students, but the time zone issues matter, and so we've tried to address that in grouping. We use the same groups for lecture and lab, and all the same software. We won't link groups again in the future. I don't think that was more trouble, I think, than it was worth. There were some grouping issues for sure. A few people wrote and said, I hate my group members. They're not doing anything. This person didn't. But, really, we have 150 groups, 500 something students. They're switching all the time and things are happening. And the number of complaints has been remarkably small. And it's amazing when you pop into these groups and you look at what's going on in these groups, they're doing amazing work. And the stuff that they have submitted is really inspiring. And so it's worked great. It's really worked great. And the students will tell you they've made friends. I'm not saying everybody's happy. They're not all happy. And it is a lot of work. This course has always been a heavy workload for students. And it turned out gender became an issue in these groups. And so after the first few groupings, I added a question on the grouping survey about whether or not you wanted to be put into a group with somebody else who was of the same gender. It turns out that I used to group with gender in mind, but I stopped at some point. But it turned out it was an issue in this course. So 10% of the students, and that's not 10% of women, that's 10% of students overall, so it's certainly more than 10% of women, said that they wanted to be grouped with at least one other woman. And I think that was based on experiences that they had at the beginning of the term when I didn't do that. There's some interesting data about why students chose synchronous versus asynchronous, but we're running late. So I think, if somebody's interested in that, you can ask about it. Mostly students were comfortable using synchronous groups, even if they were a little worried about their internet. We used Teams. This probably doesn't even look like a slide to people who use Microsoft Teams a lot, but we use this software, Microsoft Teams. I can talk to you some more about how we pulled off synchronous groups of 4 with 500 students in the course, and the answer is we used this software Teams, which was very useful to us. We shifted a little bit what we prioritize in terms of assessments and grades. We're looking at communicating scientific ideas to others in writing and orally more than we did in the face-to-face course. We're focusing on writing good solutions more than we did in the face-to-face course, working collaboratively, and self-evaluating your understanding and engaging in self-directed learning. So the labs, Meg Ward is in charge of this lab renovation, restructuring project. I'm always renovating a house too, so we're not renovating the labs, we're restructuring them. She's done just an incredible job. So she had this really challenging project to try to do better with our introductory labs. Again, this was a physics education research-based finding. This is a Physics Today article written by Carl Weinman and Natasha Holmes. Carl is a Nobel Prize winner. Natasha is an assistant professor at Cornell University. They both were at UBC is where this work started. And their main finding was that most labs don't add much to students in any way. So their measure was a student takes the lab, a student doesn't take the lab. Those two groups of students, is there any measurable learning in the lab group that you don't see in the lecture group. Like the lecture group has this much learning. How much learning does the lab group have? It should be more. They're taking the lab, right? In some ways, you should be able to measure additional learning associated with the lab. And they looked at it carefully and in particular ways. And what they found was that the lab had very little impact on how much the students learned. And so they asked the question, so why not just decouple lab from the lectures, since it's not really helping students understand the acceleration due to gravity very much, decouple it from the lecture, and use the lab periods for what lab does best. And that is to focus the course on developing a love of experiment and some experience with experimental design. So now our labs focus on developing experimental skills and critical thinking, and students learn how to make observations and measurements. That's really what the focus is on. How to build models based on those measurements, and then to look at when there are deviations between the expectations of the model and the experimental results. What does that tell you, and what do you do? I think I probably should stop there, but I have to tell you quickly about one of these labs that we did. So the students got kits, and this is a Hooke's Law lab. And so Hooke's Law is a spring force lab. You pull down on the spring pulls up with a spring force that is proportional to the amount that the spring is stretched. And K is a spring constant. It's assumed constant and a characteristic of the spring. So the students get this lab kit, and in the lab kit is this little tiny spring and a paper meter stick, measuring tape. And then you can hang something off of this spring that you can put a liquid into. Water is what we used, and water has this nice easy density and all of this stuff. And so you basically just pour water into this container, and based on they had in their lab kit this inexpensive little graduated cylinder, and based on how many milliliters of water you pour into this container, you know how much mass you've added to the end of the spring, and you can take measurements of the force, which is the weight going downward, and the amount that the spring is. This model, so these slides, this slide is the slide that the students got in lab. And I was fortunate to be able to be involved in both the lab project and the lecture project. It was really a great term for me. So this model, what we tell the students is this model implies or assumes the following. That no extension of the spring, no stretch of the spring is no force, means there's no spring force. That there's a linear relationship between the spring force and the amount the spring is stretched or compressed, because the spring constant is assumed to be, the spring value K is assumed to be constant. We call it the spring constant. These are the assumptions of this model. There's no time dependence or history dependence in K. Again, an assumption of the model. And the students are asked this. In this lab, you need to design an experiment to test the validity of that model and its assumptions for a variety of systems, or at least a couple different systems, and under a variety of different conditions and in different sort of domains. So this is a place where we really want to push them to a place where the model doesn't work. We want them to look for places where the model doesn't work. We do a lot with graphing and uncertainties, in general, they are asked to do an initial pilot experiment and decide whether or not things are behaving the way they expect. And then they plan and engage in some follow-up experiment where they sort of extend their model. So that's just one sort of quick example of what really was a great experience in lab as well. So we had both a lecture-based course and a lab-based course where, because of these duty projects that the dean started, bless his heart, thank you, we were in a great position to do wonderful things with our students when they were stuck home with COVID. And so I'm super thankful both to Meg Ward and to Richard Epp for being really great collaborators and putting up with me. I talk a lot. And I'm opinionated. And we had great undergraduate students, Urja, Jack, Megan, Narv, really super helpful, and our graduate TAs as well. We couldn't do it without them. They did a lot of checking in on groups and just making sure things functioned the way they were supposed to. The department at Waterloo is really an awesome department in terms of teaching. They have really a deep bench in terms of high quality teachers. And it's a great place to do PER for exactly the reason that I thought it would be, and that is large numbers. And one of the things that's really noticeable to me is that maybe because of the astronomy program, there are a large number of women in these courses. And so for the first time in my life, I think I'm in a position where I can do sort of gender studies as well. And I think that would be really interesting going forward. I'm looking forward to doing that. So I'm really thankful to you for taking some time out of your day to sit here and listen to me yak. And I want to encourage you to hear an even better talk in the future. So the next talk is called "The Good, the Bad, and the Weird." It's January 28th at 7 p.m., but I'm sure you'll get some announcements. So the speaker is Joseph Nisimov. He's in the Department of Biology, and he is an environmental microbiologist and studies viruses in the aquatic environment. So I hope you can join us for that talk. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. Thank you for your attention.